Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The events, characters, and situations are the product of the author's imagination, and no part of this story is intended to depict real-life individuals or events. Life had a way of feeling predictable in the best possible sense. My husband, Mark, and I have been married for 8 years, and our days flowed in an easy, steady rhythm. We had our morning coffee ritual, our Sunday grocery trips, and our shared habit of watching old sitcoms before bed. It wasn't a perfect marriage, no marriages, but it was stable, safe, and deeply familiar. We knew each other's quirks, from the way he hummed when brushing his teeth to the way I refused to fold laundry until I had a podcast playing in the background. Part of that comfortable rhythm included the people who floated in and out of our lives. There were the neighbors we waved to without ever learning their names, the barista who remembered our order, and, of course, Daniel, my husband's longtime friend. Daniel had been around since before I even met Mark. He was the kind of guy who could walk into our kitchen without knocking, open the fridge, and help himself to a drink. It never bothered me. In fact, I liked that about him. It made me feel like we were part of a bigger, extended family. Daniel was a fixture at our weekend barbecues, holiday dinners, and the occasional late-night game of cards. He was easy to be around, funny without trying too hard, and always ready to help if something around the house broke. I never thought much beyond that. In my mind, Daniel was just Daniel, my husband's friend. The three of us had our comfortable roles. Mark and Daniel would sit out back, talking about sports or work while I bustled around inside, bringing out snacks or refilling drinks. I didn't realize it then, but I was never truly alone with Daniel. There was always someone else in the room, another voice in the conversation, another presence to make sure the boundaries stayed neat and unblurred. If you had asked me at that time whether I found Daniel attractive, I would have laughed. Not because he wasn't, objectively speaking, he was, but because it seemed irrelevant. He belonged to another category in my mind, like a brother-in-law or a childhood friend. You just didn't think of them that way. Looking back now, I see how easily that kind of thinking can shift. At the time, though, life was steady, uncomplicated, and reliable. I didn't know that all it would take was one night, one unexpected moment, to change the way I saw him, and maybe even the way I saw myself. That was the beauty and the danger of comfort. It made you feel safe, but it also made you forget that everything can change in the blink of an eye. Daniel had a way of weaving himself into the background of our lives so effortlessly that I never really noticed how present he was. He wasn't the type to demand attention or make a grand entrance. He was just there. The guy who helped Mark move furniture when we bought our new couch. The one who stayed late after a barbecue to help clean up without being asked. The friend who knew exactly where we kept the spare trash bags because he'd been in our kitchen often enough to remember. He had an easy charm that made people feel comfortable, the kind of quiet charisma that didn't need to be loud to be felt. He could joke with Mark about the latest basketball game one minute and talk to me about my work deadlines the next without missing a beat. I used to think it was just friendliness, the mark of a good friend. But sometimes, in hindsight, I wonder if there were small things I missed, a glance that lingered a second longer than it should have, or a question that dug just a little deeper than casual conversation required. Daniel also had a knack for timing his visits perfectly. He always seemed to stop by when Mark was just about to fire up the grill, or when I had just baked something fresh. It became a running joke between the three of us. "Do you have a tracking device on our oven, Danny?" I once teased. He just grinned and shrugged. Mark trusted Daniel completely, maybe more than he trusted anyone else. They had been friends since college, through first jobs, bad breakups, and all the messiness that comes before settling down. There was a loyalty there, a brotherhood, and I respected that. I liked knowing that my husband had someone in his life who would drop everything to be there for him. For me, Daniel was part of the package of being married to Mark. Just like our Sunday pancake tradition or our creaky front porch, Daniel was simply a part of our world. There was comfort in that consistency. I never imagined questioning it. We even had a sort of shorthand in our interactions. Small inside jokes about Mark's forgetfulness or his obsession with perfectly lining up the lawn chairs before guests arrived. Daniel and I could roll our eyes at each other in shared amusement when Mark went into one of his host mode frenzies. It wasn't intimacy, at least not in the way I understood it. It was familiarity. But looking back, I realized that familiarity is a strange thing. It's like water wearing down stone. It's slow, subtle, and easy to overlook until you see how much has changed. At the time, though, I had no reason to think twice about Daniel's presence in our lives. He was just my husband's friend, always around, always welcome, at least until that night. It was a Thursday evening in late September, the kind of night where the air feels crisp but the scent of summer still lingers. Mark had left earlier that morning for an overnight work trip out of town. We'd gone through our usual pre-trip routine, me double-checking that he had packed his charger, him teasing me for fussing over his travel snacks. He kissed me goodbye, promised to call before bed, and then he was gone. I didn't mind the occasional night alone. Sometimes it felt nice to have the house all to myself, to make a simple dinner, curl up on the couch with a blanket, and watch whatever show I wanted without negotiating over the remote. That night, I had just poured myself a glass of wine and was halfway through a cooking competition show when I heard the knock at the door. It wasn't a hurried knock, more of a casual, familiar rhythm. When I opened the door, there was Daniel, standing there with his easy smile, holding a small brown paper bag. "Hey," he said, lifting the bag. "Mark left this in my car earlier this week. Thought I'd drop it off." I glanced inside the bag. It was a travel-sized toolkit Mark sometimes kept in his car. Something he definitely didn't need urgently tonight. Still, I stepped aside and gestured for Daniel to come in. "You could have just given it to him tomorrow," I said as he walked into the living room. He shrugged, dropping into the armchair across from the couch. "Yeah, but I was nearby, and I figured you might want some company." It was such a simple statement, said so casually that I didn't think much of it. I went to the kitchen, grabbed an extra glass, and poured him some wine. We talked about nothing at first. The weather, a mutual friend's engagement, a new restaurant that had just opened downtown. The kind of filler conversation you have with someone you've known for years. But as the minutes passed, I noticed something different. There was no Mark here tonight to lead the conversation, to fill the silences. It was just Daniel and me. Alone. The quiet moments between topics felt heavier than usual. When I laughed, his eyes stayed on me a second longer than I expected. When our knees accidentally brushed as I set my glass down, neither of us moved right away. I didn't recognize it in the moment, but something had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way I could name, but subtly enough that the air between us felt warmer. The night was still young, and though I didn't know it yet, it was far from over. At first, the conversation stayed in safe, familiar territory. Stories about Mark from their college days, mutual friends we hadn't seen in years, even a funny memory about the time our grill caught fire during a 4th of July barbecue. But somewhere between the second glass of wine and the low hum of music playing in the background, the tone began to shift. Daniel leaned back in the chair, his posture relaxed, but his eyes unusually focused. "You know," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, "Mark's lucky. Not just because of the house or the job, but because of you." I laughed, waving the compliment away. "Oh, please. He's the one who puts up with me. I'm not exactly easy to live with." "I'm serious," Daniel said, his voice softer now. "You make things feel warm, comfortable, like home." Something in his tone caught me off guard. It wasn't flirtatious exactly, but it was personal in a way that felt different. This wasn't the usual teasing or lighthearted banter. His words carried a weight I wasn't sure what to do with. I tried to lighten the moment. "That's sweet, Daniel, but I think the wine's getting to you." He smiled faintly, but didn't look away. Maybe, or maybe I've just never said it out loud before. The conversation drifted into more personal territory after that. He told me about his last serious relationship, how it ended not with a fight, but with a slow fading that neither of them could stop. I found myself opening up in return, admitting things I rarely said out loud, even to Mark. How sometimes, even in a good marriage, there were moments of loneliness. How I missed feeling surprised, feeling seen in unexpected ways. It was strange how easily the words came out. Daniel wasn't just listening, he was hearing me, nodding in the right places, asking thoughtful questions, looking at me as if I were saying something worth remembering. The pauses between our sentences stretched a little longer. His gaze lingered a little more. I noticed the way the lamplight softened the edges of his face, how his voice had a low steadiness to it that felt safe. And yet, there was something undeniably charged about the air between us. It wasn't that anything inappropriate had happened, not yet. But my awareness of him had shifted. The sound of his laugh, the way his eyes searched mine before he spoke, it all felt amplified. I told myself it was just the wine, just the intimacy of a quiet night between two people who happened to be alone. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The boundaries I'd never thought twice about were starting to blur. Somewhere between laughter and silence, the mood in the room changed. It wasn't abrupt. There was no sudden, obvious moment. It was more like the temperature had shifted by a few degrees, enough for me to notice without knowing exactly when it happened. Daniel had moved from the armchair to the other end of the couch, closer than before, but still far enough for the space between us to feel intentional. My glass of wine sat untouched now. I was more focused on the way his voice sounded in the quiet. Lower, more deliberate. He was telling me about a trip he took last year, hiking alone in the mountains. His words painted the scene so vividly I could almost smell pine and feel the cool, sharp air on my skin. I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn into the cadence of his story. And then there were the small things. The way his knee shifted, brushing against mine for just a second longer than polite. The subtle tilt of his head when I spoke, as though he was memorizing my words. The kind of little details you don't notice with someone you've known for years, until suddenly you do. When the wind outside picked up and rattled the windows, I glanced toward the curtains. That's when the lights flickered. Just once, but enough to make me set my glass down. Guess the weather's turning, I murmured. Daniel looked toward the window, then back at me. Good thing I stopped by. Wouldn't want you sitting here all alone in the dark. It was a harmless comment, or maybe it wasn't. I couldn't tell anymore. My heartbeat felt a fraction faster than it had an hour ago, and the room seemed smaller than it had when the night began. The conversation slowed, but not in a way that made me want to fill the silence. It was a charged kind of quiet, the kind where you're suddenly aware of every breath, every slight movement. At one point, I caught his eyes on me, not darting away when I noticed. He just looked steady, searching, and then, almost as if he sensed my thoughts, he smiled. Not the usual easy, lopsided grin I was used to, but something gentler, softer. It made something inside me shift in a way I didn't fully understand. I told myself it was just the wine, or maybe the eeriness of the changing weather. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something unspoken had passed between us, something that couldn't be undone. The space between what we were and what we might become had just gotten smaller. And the night was far from over. The storm arrived in full not long after, rain tapping against the windows, wind howling through the trees, and the occasional low rumble of thunder in the distance. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, leaving the house in a soft darkness broken only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. I felt the shift instantly. Without the hum of electricity, the world outside the living room seemed to fade, and all that remained was the quiet space between us. Well, I said with a small laugh, guess we're going old school tonight. Daniel grinned, his teeth catching the dim light. Good thing I'm handy. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small flashlight, setting it upright on the coffee table so the beam pointed toward the ceiling, casting a warm, diffused glow across the room. The light made everything feel closer, smaller, like we'd been placed under a glass dome. I sat back on the couch, pulling the throw blanket over my legs. Daniel shifted closer, his knee brushing mine again, but this time neither of us moved away. We talked in quieter tones now, the storm making the room feel cocooned from the rest of the world. He asked me about my dreams, the things I'd wanted for my life before marriage. I told him truths I rarely spoke aloud, how I'd once planned to live in another city, how I sometimes missed the version of myself that existed before I became someone's wife. He listened without interrupting, his eyes steady on mine. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "You're still that person. You just don't see her anymore." The words caught me off guard. They felt intimate, almost too much for the small space we were in. And then, without quite realizing I was doing it, I held his gaze longer than I should have. The sound of rain against the windows seemed to fade. It was just his eyes, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the closeness of his presence. "Daniel," I started, but I didn't know what I was going to say. He leaned in slightly, just enough that I could feel the warmth of him. His voice was low when he spoke. "I've thought about this before, about what it would be like to be closer to you, to really know you." The air between us was thick, heavy with everything unspoken. My heart was pounding in my ears. For a long moment, neither of us moved. And then the sound of Mark's ringtone, my husband's custom chime, cut through the air from my phone on the coffee table. The spell broke. I reached for it with trembling hands. When I finally answered the call, Mark's voice came through warm and familiar, a lifeline pulling me back into the world I knew. He was checking in from his hotel room, asking how my night was going, telling me about the long dinner meeting he'd just finished. I kept my tone steady, light, not betraying the fact that my pulse was still racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Daniel sat quietly as I spoke, his gaze fixed on the floor. When I hung up, there was a pause, a strange, delicate moment where neither of us seemed to know how to move forward. "I should probably get going," he said finally, standing and reaching for his jacket. His voice was even, but his eyes held something I couldn't read. I walked him to the door, the sound of rain now soft and steady instead of pounding. We exchanged a simple good night, and then he was gone, swallowed up by the dark street and the wet hiss of tires on asphalt. The house felt impossibly still after that. I turned off the flashlight, climbed into bed, and stared at the ceiling. Every detail of the evening replayed in my mind. The way his voice had dropped when he spoke to me, the way his eyes had lingered, the exact moment I'd realized we had crossed an invisible line. I told myself nothing had happened. No physical boundary had been crossed, no betrayal I could point to. And yet, my chest felt tight with the weight of something I couldn't name. When morning came, the sky was a pale, washed-out gray, and the streets were littered with fallen leaves from the storm. I moved through the kitchen in a daze, making coffee, checking my phone, avoiding my own reflection in the window. Mark came home that afternoon, cheerful and tired from his trip. He kissed me hello, told me he missed me, and launched into stories from the night before. I smiled where appropriate, nodded at the right times, but all the while, I felt like I was moving through water. At one point, he mentioned Daniel in passing, saying they'd grab lunch later in the week. My stomach tightened, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know what Daniel might say about me, about that night. The strangest part was how quickly life seemed to slip back into its familiar rhythm. Breakfasts were made, bills were paid, laundry was folded. But beneath the surface, something was different. I was different, and no matter how much I tried to bury it, the memory of that night stayed close. A quiet echo I couldn't shake, a reminder that trust and loyalty can shift in ways you never expect. For days afterward, I carried the memory of that night like a pebble in my shoe, small enough to hide, but impossible to ignore. I'd be washing dishes or folding laundry, and suddenly a flash of it would return. The closeness of his knee, the weight of his gaze, the way my name had sounded in his voice. I told myself it was harmless, that a moment suspended in time didn't have the power to rewrite a marriage. But I also knew that the way I'd felt, the pull, the curiosity, the quickening of my heartbeat, was a sign that something in me was restless. One afternoon, when Mark was at work, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold and asked myself a question I'd been avoiding. Did I want more from Daniel, or was I searching for something I'd lost in myself? The answer was uncomfortable, painful even. Daniel hadn't created the gap I felt. He'd only shown me it was there. So I made a decision, not about him, but about me. That evening, I waited for Mark to come home. We had dinner like always, and afterward I told him I wanted to talk. I told him I missed feeling connected, missed the late-night conversations we used to have, the way we used to laugh until our sides hurt. I didn't mention Daniel's name. That part of the story wasn't his burden to carry. Not now, not when nothing physical had happened. Mark listened, really listened, in a way I hadn't felt from him in a long time. He reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "Then let's fix it. Together." It wasn't a magic solution. Nothing changes overnight. But in that moment, I realized I wanted to fight for us, for the life we'd built, for the person I'd promised to be when I said I do. As for Daniel, I saw him a few days later when he came by to see Mark. We exchanged a polite hello, and while his eyes lingered a second longer than necessary, there was no charge in the air this time. No flicker of what had almost happened. It was as if we had silently agreed to place that night in a box, lock it, and leave it there. But I carry the key, not because I want to reopen it, but because I know it's a part of me now, a reminder that temptation doesn't always come crashing in. Sometimes it slips quietly through the door when you least expect it. And the real choice isn't about who you're drawn to. It's about who you decide to walk toward when the moment passes. For me, that choice was, and will always be, my husband. Even if the night that changed everything will never truly fade. 41.